I'm here with Tom and Judy Dawson, authors of the Hockman Encyclopedia of American Playing Cards, and foremost experts in the world of card collecting and all things pasteboards. Tom, Judy, maybe we should start at the beginning with the development of playing cards.
Well, it's a good place to start. Nobody knows really the true history of playing cards, but we all believe that they started in the Far East, probably playing games like chess and war games with pieces that developed into something a little cheaper, perhaps to manufacture or to make, were sheets of paper with pictures on them, and eventually developed into the kinds of cards that we know today. And they likely came across the continent from the Far East across into North Africa, into the Middle East, and eventually across the Mediterranean and into Italy, Spain, France, particularly in the early days. So the earliest cards that we kind of think of as our cards are from Europe and from probably 1300s, although there's few references, there are very few around that anybody's actually seen. But we do know of cards from the 1400s. And just as an example, these are some beautiful hand-done cards by a famous artist in Italy who did a deck for one of the royal families of absolutely gorgeous cards. Now, the Italian and the French and the Spanish all had different suit signs and different ways of putting cards together to make packs. But most of them had 4 suits and a various number of cards in the suits. They didn't use the traditional diamonds, clubs, hearts, and spades that we use now. They used cups and swords and clubs, and bells, and all kinds of different symbols were used before we got excuse me, more to where we're standardized today. The initial cards were pretty basic things. There were sheets of paper, usually blank on the back, with the design of some kind of design of the card on the front. Eventually, though, things started to develop, and the French particularly had a lot of very good card makers and made a lot of interesting cards. And I wanted to show you a page out of a book of old French cards, 1600s, 1700s. Perhaps you can just see that. And these cards are really the forerunner of what we use around the world today in most countries. Now, all of these, obviously, the old decks from Germany and places like that, there's still games where they use them, but most people playing bridge, playing poker, playing whatever, are using a fairly standardized deck. They're based on these old French designs. Since then, cards have developed to be much easier used by players and by magicians, for example, for manipulation, etc. And some of the techniques that were used were to put images on the back or to put designs on the back, to add indices in the corners. You're all familiar with corner indices, to help identify what the card was, to put special coatings on the paper and improvement in manufacturing processes that allowed thinner, more readily usable cards, easy to handle, easy to fan, easy to see, and to slide easy, to shuffle easy, to deal easy, etc. In, say, the 1800s, and we used to refer to cards as pasteboards. They were rather thick and bulky, and I've got an example here of an English pack, probably twice the thickness of one of today's bicycle decks. The cards also went from having just a single picture, what we call a single-ended card, to a double-ended card, so that the image was reversed and cut halfway, in effect. So I think those are the main things that aided the development to what we now have today. I wanted to show you 2 different things that were of interest that came out in the 1800s. One was a form of index which was called a triplicate, which actually, if you can see, had a miniature card in the corner of the main card instead of the kind of index we have today, which would be a 4 in this case and a little sign for clubs. It actually had a miniature of the card. That was put out by Doherty, who were a big manufacturer, and their main competition at that time was the New York Consolidated Card Company, and they said, well, we've got to have something that does the same thing. So they developed the index, or indices, that we now know today And they called these squeezers because when you squeeze the deck, you could see much more of the cards much more readily than you could with the old pasteboards. So from there, we've progressed to what you all know now, bicycle cards for tricks and gambling, narrower cards for bridge and whist and games like that. And it's been a fascinating journey, and there'll be more developments. But one last point, many people have tried to introduce innovations into cards, change the suit signs, change the way the kings, queens, and jacks are portrayed, etc. They never last. They always go back to the old designs and the same styles with the slight improvements that we've talked about.
We all know playing cards are used for more than just great magic tricks, but it might surprise you to learn that they've been used throughout history for more than just playing cards. Tom, Judy, maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Fine, Ben. As you said, cards are used for magic, and it always amazes me what magicians can do with cards. I've tried to learn a few simple things. Hopeless. Anyway, what else were they used for? Well, we all know how many games there are. There must be 1,000 or 5,000 or 10,000 different games you can play with a deck of cards. And cards come in, surprisingly, perhaps to many of your friends and people, cards come in many more sizes and packs than you're accustomed to with 52 cards and a couple of jokers or a joker. There are cards, decks of 24 cards for different games, 28, 32, 36, 40, 48, 52, 56. There's 78 card decks. There's 97 card decks. The people in India use decks, I think there are 108 cards. So a deck of cards means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So there's a lot of local, regional games that are played. There's standard games that are used around the world. For example, bridge, for example, poker, which is so popular these days. But cards have also been used over the years for a lot of things, very seriously, for fortune telling. And do you have any fortune telling cards there you could show us?
Yeah, there's one here. This is the Nile fortune telling deck with the fortunes on it. So these were used, and this was a very popular deck of cards. It's been produced for many years, still being produced probably.
Okay, and then there were tarot cards, which it's a whole other area, but there are many, many people interested in tarot cards. There are many popular fancy designs. Most tarot decks have 78 cards. They have 22 trumps and 4 court cards or face cards in each pack for each of the suits, plus the 10 pip cards. And tarots have some fantastic designs, and I think they've also led into a bit into the occult and mystery and fortune telling. So
This is actually,
do you have any of those
with
you could
new
show us?
cards, this is a very collectible thing too. The new tarot cards are highly, highly collectible. If anybody here does eBay, you will know that they go for a lot of money, even if they're only 20 years old. So obviously, if they're very old, they go for a great deal of money. Okay, yes, and do I have tarot cards? I do. Here is an example of quite an old tarot card, obviously quite unique. Another one, this is the pip card for the tarot card, and the ace for it with the name of the maker on it. This one says 1748, but it actually isn't 1748. It is a repro, but it's a repro that's well over 100 years old. The ones that we really like are the very old ones from the 1700s with animals. They're called the animal tarot. So this is an example of these.
I might add, the 22 trumps, always each trump has a different picture on it, and it has a different meaning in divination and in magic. And also cards were used for education, maps, historical information, fables, you name it. Anybody who wanted to get a message across to help teach something often used playing cards. Arithmetic, even animals, wild animals, birds. There's so many different ways they were used that for educational purposes. Souvenirs, the cards make great souvenirs, and over the years, souvenir decks have been very popular with a photo on each card. So each card, instead of just having the 3 spade pips, will have a picture of some area of the country, for instance, or of the World's Fair, if it happened to be a fair one, etc.
Also railway. Also railways. Many wonderful
Had
railway
pictures from
cards.
along the route, right?
We have different railway cards here. This is a Canadian one. Beautiful, beautiful picture from about 1908.
And the other side?
It's got it. And this one, which is also an American one, with it's called the Cotton Belt Railway for obvious reasons.
Ran through the South. So another thing that happened with cards, particularly in the earlier days when they had plain white backs, is they became quite useful for other things because paper and cardboard was expensive. So old discarded cards with plain backs became very useful for making notes, for indexing things, for sending out invitations, for making calling cards, IOUs, free coupons.
Canadian money cards are very interesting. We don't obviously have any. They're extraordinarily rare, and they're in the museum. But they were actually used in Quebec as money, many, in the 1700s again. That's how old they are.
There was recently an exhibit on cards used as currency in Montreal, so I think it's touring.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
right.
I
They're
didn't
from the
even know
Mint.
that.
The Mint has a small collection.
And they're very,
So they would write
rare
it's-
and very valuable.
And they would write it's 1 franc, whatever, signed by the governor or something, so to make sure it wasn't just a counterfeit.
It's partly because paper was so rare. It was so rare then that anything that could be used was used. So that's the reason that those blank back cards became very valuable just to use as paper.
Have you ever seen any at auction or seen any recently at auction?
Not money cards, but lots of secondary use cards. They were used for ball invitations. They were used as just as an IOU, or we have a number of those as well.
I guess the final use of cards, just add something slightly different, was for building card houses. And perhaps as kids you took a pack of cards and stacked them up, made houses. But there's people who make fantastic things as big as this room, castles and everything, you know, using hundreds and hundreds of decks of cards. It's quite fascinating. We had one of them at our convention of 52 Plus Joker, which is a card collecting club, one year, who built some amazing things.
His name was Brian Berg, and he's well known. He's definitely lots of him on YouTube, and it's unbelievable what that guy can build. It's just amazing. Well worth looking him up.
Recently, advertisers have placed a premium on the card boxes that the decks come in, 30% thicker or embossed casing. But throughout history, advertisers have done many interesting things in order to sell and package their cards. Tom, Judy, maybe you can tell us about that.
You mentioned these special boxes that are now being used to make to put playing cards in as part of the marketing of the cards. And you might wonder what kind of boxes were used originally. Well, the answer to that is they weren't in boxes. They basically were wrapped in paper wrappers. And I just want to show you an example of one. This is a French wrapper from 1672, which was used not only to wrap the cards, but then discarded when the cards were played with. But somebody said, there's some nice piece of paper I can use, and they've made a whole lot of notes on it on a completely different subject, which is, again, a sort of secondary use of wrappers if you want to talk about that. From those rather plain wrappers, usually with the maker's name and some kind of a logo on it, they developed fancier and fancier wrappers as the 1800s progressed, and they got the concept that wrappers were kind of fragile, which they are, so very few have survived over the years, and perhaps something that was a little sturdier would be better to house the cards and shipment, etc., etc. So they started developing boxes. There are boxes where there's an outer case and an inner case. There are boxes that are just a flap at the top. There are fancy boxes that were made for presentations. And Judy has a whole slew of boxes and various assorted packaging, which you might be interested in.
So we can start with just a wrapper that is not that uncommon from a deck. This is a souvenir deck from at least 1908. And they would wrap some of them in this. Normally they would be in a wrapper that was made of glycine, which is really like cellophane, more like wax paper. And it's very unusual to be lucky enough to buy a deck with this still intact, because obviously when you put it in, you tore it. So they took it off and tossed it away, as Tom said. Then this is an interesting way that they did an advertising deck for Clismatic Waters. And so it's 2 little drawers with 2 different cards in it. And they've got the name of the company on top. Unfortunately, it's all mucked up. Congress playing cards, still familiar. These are old. This was a store packaging that they would send out to the various retailers to display the different designs of the different decks. These are all scenic, obviously, and that's the way they came. We have this one, which was published in 1934, was it, Tom?
Approximately.
And it's a war deck, and it was a beautiful little book. And then inside the deck, this deck happens to be still in its playing card wrapper, which is called the Yankee Division Playing Cards. And it's a fabulous deck inside with wonderful court cards depicting different areas of the war. Then we have this, which has always been a favorite of ours. It isn't anything special. It's a normal tuck case box, but it has an absolutely wonderful, wonderful picture on the front. This is another type of packaging that I really like. This is made by the American Banknote Company, and these are the wonderful backs that you people seem to like so much with these unusual designs, but just a very pretty box. This is much more modern. This deck came out about 20 years ago, and it was packaged beautifully with this, and then this, and there came with a coin in it, and it's a circus transformation deck. So this is the Ace of Spades with the transformed thing on it, and a lovely
What is a
box.
transformation deck?
I knew you'd ask that because we haven't been asked that yet. So the transformation decks are probably our favorite, a lot of people's favorite, where they actually transformed the pip cards into a design. So I'm trying to find one here. Here is one. This is a 3 of hearts, has been designed in a circus scene, using the hearts as part of the costume. So this is a transformation deck, is really a wonderful deck. They're hand transformation decks, which are amazing, that are early. They're still being made because people love this. So the new transformation decks are also extremely collectible. New transformation decks are very collectible as well as old. This one was done in 1988. But there's one more deck I really want to show. This is actually a member of our club who designed this fabulous deck. This was one of the early decks done on a computer. And this is really an amazing deck. So her packaging is absolutely wonderful. She's got this, which tucks in here neatly, and then ties all of this together. And the deck itself is very stunning. It's just done in 12 colors, including metallics. And I'm not going to open it actually to show you, but it is an absolutely wonderful deck, and we all think her packaging is unbelievable. So people are always coming up with new ideas for packaging, and this is just one of many. So it just does up like that, and then it's perfectly safe.
Mostly designed to help market and merchandise the product.
Yeah, especially these latter few.
I forgot.
And what's this?
Oh, and
What
this
is
one.
Yeah.
Sorry, this was done in 1928 by the United States Playing Card Company, and this was particularly a Christmas variety because it's got holly on it, and these decks are in it, plus they've got the tally cards and everything else, and it was given out at a dinner, actually, and there's a book all about playing cards inside it that came with it.
This book by a well-known writer on the history of playing cards, little book to go with the whole set. Gorgeous set, and quite scarce because there only were a few made for the dinner.
So now that we've had a chance to learn about the development of playing cards, the history, the packaging, the cards themselves, you're probably excited to start collecting your own cards. Tom, Judy, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what they need to do to start collecting.
We have decided to collect older cards, mainly American and mainly standard cards. Not to say we don't like the non-standard or we don't collect European, but that's our focus and our specialty. And in collecting anything, you really have to have some focus. You can't collect all the coins in the world, all the stamps in the world, all the barbed wire in the world, or whatever else it is you happen to be collecting. So some people collect standard cards, and some collect only cards that are non-standard. We have a very good friend here in the city who's got a wonderful collection of American non-standard cards.
What is the difference between a standard and non-standard?
Well, standard card is what you're accustomed to seeing in your average, say, bicycle deck now, with the normal kings, queens, and jacks, and the normal layout of the pips on the pip cards. A non-standard deck would have non-standard faces. In other words, the court cards would be different. They might be elaborate designs. They may be beautiful women. Who knows what they might be. The pip cards may or may not be normal, but it's more relates to the question of the face cards. But if you take a souvenir deck, for example, you will have one back, say a picture of a mountain in New Hampshire, and each of the cards will have pictures of scenes in New Hampshire, each one different, so that when you visited New Hampshire on your honeymoon and you went back home, you had a nice recollection. You had your photograph album, if you will. And of course, they started back in the 1890s when photography was quite new and pictures were expensive to take, I guess, and develop, and films, etc. So that's the difference, if that helps. Okay, the various kinds of non-standard cards there are would relate often to history. There are revolutionary French cards where the kings, queens, and jacks were chopped and they became peasants or muses or philosophers. There are royal cards, comic cards, souvenir cards I mentioned. There are tobacco insert cards and other companies, cereal companies, and what else, Judy?
Definitely advertising.
Advertising cards, transformation cards.
A lot of war cards. All the wars have been portrayed on cards. All the births, a lot of births have been, births of royalties have been on cards. It's incredible.
Marriages.
You can actually create a whole history from collecting old playing cards, for sure.
Then we have people then who collect these decks. We also have people who only collect single cards, and usually for the back interest, but there are a number of people who collect only aces of spades, because the ace of spades usually has a special design and has the maker's name on it. There are people who collect only jokers. There are people who collect only tens of clubs and things like that, but they're kind of in the minority. Then there are most single collectors collect backs. They're interested in varieties of backs, perhaps on specific topics, maybe horses, for example, or scenes, or who knows. But they collect single cards for some interest that they have. And I guess
the joker collectors are actually the bane of a playing card collector's existence, because they take those wonderful jokers out of the deck and leave you the deck without the jokers. And immediately the value of that deck, if it's an old deck, goes down probably 10 times at least. So it might be a $500 deck, and you're lucky if you can get $50 for it because it's missing that valuable joker. It means a lot. When the joker is unusual, if I could show one, for example, imagine if this was in a standard deck and this was the joker and you got the deck without this joker, how valueless that deck would become.
significantly. And I think that leads to another part of collecting. If you collect decks, or even if you collect singles, condition is important, as in any collectible. A mint stamp's worth a lot more than a beat-up old canceled stamp, normally. So it's the same with playing cards. Mint, as they came from the factory, is the perfect way to find them. You rarely do. But the less used they are, and no tears and rips and soiling, the more valuable they become if you're looking at value, or if you're looking at it from the cost perspective.
It is amazing. Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah.
It is amazing on some of these very early decks of cards where they have the gold edges, and those gold edges are just unbelievable. So if you get scruffy gold edges, it's not like having the shiny, shiny gold edges.
One nice thing about collecting is being able to research what you've just found. And there are a lot of books and topics on the subject in magazines, etc., over the last several centuries. There are also collecting clubs. We belong to a North American playing card collecting club called 52 Plus Joker. So again, the importance of the Joker. There's other clubs in North America. There's an International Playing Card Society, and most countries have their own club, which perhaps is devoted more or less to the cards that are unique or particular to that country and area. So there's lots of resources to help you identify what you've found or what you have. And finally, I think the best thing to do would be just to show you a variety of different cards. Many of these have come from decks, and we're not showing you the whole deck, but just showing a few cards of different types to perhaps put a little emphasis on what we were saying about the various aspects of collecting. So Judy, why don't you do that?
Well, one thing I was also going to say is that when you are a collector, I know how interested everybody is in these new decks. The thing is, if a new deck made by Dan and Dave or somebody comes out, it comes out in I think a limited edition of about 5,000, I'm not sure. But most people that pick these up do pick them up thinking that they will have a lot of value one day, and they probably won't have the kind of value that you would find in an old deck of cards. Because old deck of cards are much rarer and they haven't been saved, so that if you find an early deck of cards, I was showing somebody earlier a bicycle deck, for example, that's mint from 1885. This is a real find because people bought cards to play cards, so they were well used, not saved, thinking in 100 years these decks would be worth anything. So we believe very strongly in old decks and in very limited edition decks that can be bought, of which we have very few, but we do have some because they're limited to 50 or something. So this is an example. For example, this one is an example of that. This is number 28 of 50. This girl has her cards printed, and then she actually hand colors them, and she sells them from anywhere from $50 to $125. To us, this is a very collectible deck of cards.
It's a non-standard deck?
It is a non-standard deck. Here's the queen. She's kind of standard, actually, but a takeoff on a standard deck. So, I don't know, do we want to look at some of these?
Let's just show a few jokers.
Yeah, talk about the jokers.
All right, we have a wonderful, this is a very early popular and interesting joker with the steamboat guy on it, and there are many different steamboat type jokers. Steamboat decks are a number. Probably there's 20 early from the turn of the century. There's probably 20 of at least steamboat decks with different jokers. We love advertising decks. Here's a wonderful advertising joker for a piano company, and this is a really strong interest of ours. This is one of the very earliest bicycle jokers, unlike anything that you've ever seen. The early bicycle jokers, there were 6 different designs before they settled on the king that we know now that drives off on the bicycle. These early ones were fabulous, and they actually were able, I guess the costs were so much less, they were actually able to change these from year to year, which they can't do anymore because they can't afford to do that. So bicycle anything is highly collectible. Here's an absolute favorite with all gamblers, the heathen Chinese, who, was very heavily played upon in gambling circles. He was always the foil guy.
To be a little shady.
Or a little stupid, I think. Again, a wonderful advertising deck for clown cigarettes, and the back is amazing. It kind of matches the joker. Quite a collectible
We're
deck.
talking about advertising. Why don't you show them the Coca-Cola back?
I just put out 2 Coca-Cola ones. There's millions of Coca-Cola decks. And of course, these are worth a lot of money because there's crossover with Coca-Cola collectors, of which there's literally thousands and thousands of in the world. Way more Coca-Cola collectors.
What do decks like that go for, or even singles?
This deck, we only have the single. The singles are worth around $60 to $75. The actual deck is worth about $15,000 because this is the first, and it was published in 1915. This is one that came out during the war, and this is the nurse from the war. And this is also called a spotter card because it was used to spot. Each one was different, spotting the enemy's planes. So that was actually published, so you could recognize the planes of those. Then the other thing, do you want to go into any other? This is a nice joker too. Do you want to go into any other of these kinds of things that I have out here in front of me? Have you got?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, of course. Just,
So this is an extremely early, one of the very first, can you get this, an American manufacturer, Jazaniah Ford, and he did a Ward type deck, hand colored, totally hand colored, and a very valuable deck. Again, probably in mint condition, $15,000 to $18,000 for the complete deck. We're fortunate enough to own about 4 cards of this deck. They don't probably sell quite as much as a single as maybe the Coca-Colas because of the backs.
Speaking about a crossover to collectible, what about that one?
You know, this is absolutely fabulous. This deck probably, which is 78 cards, Tom, I think it's 78 cards, and was the whole, was it the whole?
Divided by, divisible by 9 because each suit has 9 players from real baseball players from the time when 1882, something like that.
Yes, and this particular one was a Hall of Famer. So this one card probably is worth about $1,000 to $1,500 just because people are trying to put this deck together. So you do see these on eBay, and the more valuable the player, the more rare the player, the more expensive the card, clearly, and we own one. I mean, we have had others, but this one is so mint and so beautiful, and he is a Hall of Famer. We decided to keep one as an example in our collection. We don't keep everything. You can't afford to. One of the favorite areas of collecting is what is known as tobacco insert cards, and they were always beautiful burlesque cards, and the colors are spectacular. This particular one is quite beautiful, and it was done for a Harteport tobacco company, and again, because they were inserted into cigarette packages or into tobacco packages, they're collectible one by one. Many people have put together a deck by collecting 1 at a time or 3 at a time or whatever. So this is another one of the same company, and they have different companies. Very, very heavily collectible. Backs, Civil War. This is definitely a Civil War deck. Here's an example of a deck with no pips in the corner. I thought that would be interesting because we have no pips in the corner. So imagine how difficult it was to hold 13 of these in your hand. You'd have to have the spread huge because you couldn't see, for example, the 2 of clubs. If it was covered by other cards, you wouldn't know what it was, which is the reason for introducing those indices into the corner or pips into the corner. This is a spectacular German deck. It was designed as a musical deck, and actually if you put the deck together and you put the musical bars across, right, it actually played a song. So this is from about 1850, and the designs are spectacular on the court cards and the pip cards. It's a beautiful deck. We own the deck. These are just a few singles that we happen to have as well. Then we talked about transformation decks. I have some transformation cards here. This is one of the earliest decks. It was made in about 1808, I believe this one was designed. And actually on the back it says 1805, so it was done in 1805. We have a writing on the back, but you can see this is a blank back deck. This is a deck without any design in the back. And the pips form the design. So the spades form the design within it, and these decks are beautiful. They're known as the Cotta decks, and there's about 11 of them, I think. Then we get a little bit more modern into our favorite deck in the whole world, which is called the Murphy Varnish deck. Advertising is a huge collectible. This advertised Murphy Varnish. All the cards were Murphy Varnish mentioned. The court cards are spectacular, and the pip cards are all transformed into something. He's just holding the 5 diamonds. Another one, a little chewed up for the Kinney. And this last one, which I love, is called Vassar Taking the Air. So the girls are out walking with their umbrellas, and of course you can see that the clubs form the bodice. Let's get into a more recent one. It's not totally recent, but it is a more recent Ace of Spades, but I put it out because it was in color, which is unusual. Here's one for whist cards, narrow, because when they introduced whist cards, that's when they started narrowing the cards. American banknote, very descriptive with that nice, I forget what they call these
Filigree,
wonderful,
is
but
it?
filigree decks, backs, which people love. Paper Fabrique, very old Ace of Spades. This company was in production about 1870, and this is their, these Aces of Spades are like the, what do you call it, the title page of a book. It tells you who it is. Cabinet, pretty deck for USPC. Montreal deck, now this is a poor example, but this has just got such a wonderful Ace of Spades with the kings, queens, and jacks on it. And Planet, which is an advertising deck for sour mash, which I think is liquor.
Some bourbon.
Yeah, and that's kind of it.
Yeah.
What's the deck in the corner?
Aha. The modern and new big gun deck, which has been copied from the War Series deck, which we have the deck as well. Our most recent
Here's the original.
And our most recent,
Very
this
scarce.
is our most recent acquisition, and actually a wonderful story, because what we believe is that this deck is advertised in November 1918, when the war
Just at the
ended.
end.
And we think that they were pulled. And we, in all our years of collecting, we've only known 7 of these decks to show up with 4 different designs on them, war decks. We think they pulled them, and they never really sold
4
them.
separate decks, each with its own design.
So this
And
is
we
a
only know 7
repro.
in total.
USPC have just reproed this one, but there's one for the tank, there's one for the flying ace, there's one for the battleship, and one for the big gun. And this is we have just bought all 4, and we're so excited. And believe me, it cost a lot of money.
How much does a deck like that go for?
Well, this deck would be worth probably between $1,500 and $2,000.
Wow.
And if you're lucky enough to buy all 4,
It's a bit of a premium for the full set.
because it's so rare. Some of them we've only seen twice, and the others we haven't seen only once. So it was
But you can get
yes,
the
yeah,
repro.
buy the repro.
I think United States Playing Cards still has some of these, and if you were to come to the 52 Plus Joker collection, convention next September, you might be able to find one of those, because it's taking place in Erlanger, Kentucky, where the factory is, and there's going to be a factory tour, and all kinds of exciting things will be happening for card collectors. So those of you who are card collectors, put that one
Join
up.
us in.
Mid-September in Erlanger, Kentucky.
And we will be there.
Thank you guys so much for sharing your collection with us today. Hugs?
Hugs. It's been great, and we really love doing this sort of thing, and if anything we can do to help inspire people and have them understand collecting and playing cards, the more we're happy to do it.
Well, I've learned a lot. I think everyone out there has as well, and we will see you on 52 Plus Joker.
And you guys are absolutely awesome.